Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Property Finance Podcast. And today is part two of my little interview with AI, which part one was actually quite enlightening and quite a few good questions. And I'm looking forward to part two. There's definitely some interesting questions in this one as well. So part one is all about risk management. So the first question is, how can developers manage risks associated with fluctuating construction costs or project delays? So this all comes down to the team that you've got around you, is the first thing that I would say. So the only way that you can mitigate potentially against some of the costs is obviously by doing potentially a feasibility report up front. That obviously gives you the benefit of knowing what your build costs are going to be. The tendering process, obviously getting into JCT contracts, again, fixes down some of those prices. But realistically, the only way of dealing with fluctuating construction costs or delays is to rely on that team around you to either, looking at the QS, for them to come in and assist with essentially making sure that you're buying at the right prices, etc., and trying to bring some of those costings back down, or looking at your project manager, for example, to make sure that those delays don't happen. There are definitely people that you can get on board who can kind of sit behind you and help with those things. But if those delays become too much, then you may find that you have to refinance, and that could be one of the ways of dealing with those project delays is actually just refinancing. But in terms of fluctuating construction costs, realistically, the only way of dealing with that internally is by getting your QS, project manager, etc., procurement manager to deal with trying to buy at the right prices, or locking down your contractor on JCT contracts, etc., and making sure that you've got some sort of guaranteed pricing going on. Then the next question is, what happens if the project exceeds its budget or timeline? So kind of following on from the first question, if you go over budget, there are a couple of things that can happen. You could either refinance, so you could bring in some mezzanine finance potentially to cover that shortfall, or potentially if the market has moved in the 12 months or 18 months that you've been developing, you could potentially go back to your original development lender and say, look, the market's moved. We think our GDV's gone up 5-10%. Could we look to borrow a bit more money? They may cover the shortfall. You may have to bring in a private investor. You may have to raise some equity via crowdfunding as well, potentially. They're going to be the only ways really to deal with going over budget. If you exceed your timeline, there's a couple of things you can do. You can either look to refinance, which a lot of this comes back to refinancing, but it's because there's quite a few products available for refinancing, obviously sales, bridges, etc. Or you could look to go back to your original lender and again, speak to them early on and say, look, we feel like we're going to exceed our timeline here. We need to get some sort of extension, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it may be, in order to allow us to then proceed with the sales. So I think in terms of that, really your communication is key with the current lender, because they may be able to help with exceeding budgets. They may be able to help with running over timelines, or as a fallback, you've obviously got the refinancing options as well. So the last question in this section of risk management from ChatGPT is, how do lenders assess the resale or rental market viability of the development? Very simply, they rely on the valuer. So the valuer will go out and, as part of their report, they will give a viability of how well they think the property is going to sell, whether they think they're going to sit on the market for 60 days, 90 days, whether they think there's going to be maybe an extended sales period. And same with rental as well. They'll give a viability for whether they feel like there's a strong market demand for rental in the area as well. So very simply, lenders will rely on the valuer for that feedback. And many lenders also have in-house asset managers as well, who will have a fairly good idea of areas. And that's kind of why lenders stick to certain geographical locations, because they know the areas well. They've niched into those areas and they kind of know within those little mini climates what's going on and whether they're happy kind of lending there. So yeah, a lot of lenders will do one of three things. They'll either rely on their own knowledge, the asset manager's knowledge, or the valuer's knowledge, or a mix of all three. Then the next section is all around kind of profit and return. So the first question that ChatGPT has asked is, what is the typical profit margin lenders expect to see for a viable project? There's two metrics that they look at. So the first one is profit based on GDV, which normally sits around 15 to 20%. That's the sweet spot of where you want to be. And then the second one is return on loan to cost. So the return on cost, they're again looking for sort of 20, 25%. There's a bit of a myth that lenders need to see 25% profit on GDV. It's never been that high. I would say 15 to 20 is maximum of where you want to be. And that's after interest normally as well. So once you've kind of factored in your financing costs and everything else, as long as you're hitting 15% profit, most lenders are going to be pretty happy with that as well. Then the next question is, how can developers calculate a realistic return on investment? So realistic ROI. So in terms of this, I would say when it comes to, you're going to do one or two things. It's either going to be sale or refinance. So we'll talk about refinance first. So I think rather than talking about return on investment, we're going to talk about return on capital expended, or even potentially return on capital left in when it's sort of dealing with the buy-to-let side. So normally, as a rule of thumb, what you would work out is what your profit is, and then you would then work out, well, on a buy-to-let, we're going to get 75% of GDV, for example. That will then release X. Right, okay, well, we have put in ourselves personally, so this isn't talking about the development finance, but we ourselves have put in this personally. So when we look at this, right, we've got this left in the deal versus this. Right, okay, with this, however much is left in the deal, we've then got obviously rental income coming against that, and then you work a yield based against that money that you've left in the deal. So normally, if you're all money out, obviously it's an infinite return. But if you've had a little bit left in, then obviously that yield's going to be pretty high. And that's how I would work it out on a refinance. On a sale, again, very simply, I would do it based on what you've put into that deal personally. So depending on what your percentage loan to cost is, then work out profit versus that again. Most of the clients we deal with don't have any cash left in deals by the time they're finished because of the creative strategies that we use. So again, infinite returns on those funds as well. So I think in terms of working out a return on investment, I think it needs to be worked out really as a return on capital expended, and that's your own personal capital that's gone in as well. Obviously, everyone knows how to work out a return on investment if they want to work it out based on what deposits they put on, everything like that. But I think return on capital left in is probably the best way of doing it. So the next one is, what are common financial benchmarks or metrics in property development? So this is essentially a glossary, if you like. I think the main ones that we probably want to talk about are loan to cost, GDV. We've kind of touched on these a lot. I think profit versus GDV as well. We've obviously spoken about ROI as well. I think the main benchmarks that they are looking at on these ones are your profit versus GDV. They want to know what that is. They also want to know, in terms of loan to cost, they want to know what your personal money is in this deal versus that cost as well. So I think they're probably the two main benchmarks that development lenders are going to be looking at. Then this next section, ChatGPT is asking about alternative financing, which many of you who have listened to this will know this is one of my favorite topics. So first question is, how does crowdfunding or joint ventures compare to traditional bank financing? Simply put, I mean, crowdfunding is actually at the moment, the microscope that it's under is actually sitting within probably the normal parameters of development finance anyway. So most crowdfunding lenders will only go up to a maximum of 70% loan to GDV. They're very much, they don't want to push the boundaries. However, if you go down equity finance using crowdfunding, obviously that's where it can get slightly more interesting. And where it differs from bank financing is that bank financing is very set parameters. Right, we need this. We have to obviously deal with a funding line who they have to be happy with it. Whereas crowdfunding is, here's the deal, here's what we want to do. And then it's a case of putting it out to the masses and then people deciding if they want to invest based on those parameters that you've set. So I think that's where crowdfunding differs from the bank, is that with crowdfunding, you're putting the proposal forward, whereas the bank, obviously they tend to put the proposal forward and say, well, you need to fit in our box, as opposed to crowdfunding, which is you getting other people to fit into your box. When it comes to joint ventures, significantly different to bank financing, in that if you're doing a joint venture, normally what will happen is someone will come in, they'll put all of the money in, and then they'll take 50% of the profit at the back end. So you essentially become a land sourcer and a project manager to kind of run that project through for someone who's put all the money in, and then you go 50-50 at the end of it as well. Probably one of my favorite questions that ChatGPT has asked is, what are the benefits and the risks of bringing in equity partners for a development project? So the pro, I guess, is you're not going to have to put any of your own money in. That's the benefit of bringing an equity partner in. You also, as another benefit, may bring in an equity partner who's got experience. So again, it could be a shoulder to cry on if things go wrong. Could be a safe pair of hands to kind of give you a bit of advice if something starts to go wrong. They may be able to step in and assist with some stuff. The biggest risk, I think, for bringing an equity partner in is actually the same as the con, in that you're going to have none of your own money in. That's going to make raising development finance trickier, potentially, if you've got none of your own money in, especially if they're not taking shares. They may just take a charge rather than a share. It could make raising that development finance a bit trickier. The other thing is that you're potentially going to be over leveraged as well. So if the market drops, you haven't only got to worry about paying back a bank, you've then also got to pay back an equity investor as well. The other risk of bringing in an equity partner is probably one of the biggest ones, is depending who you bring in, you could end up creating more work for yourself, because they might be on the phone every 20 minutes going, oh, what's going on with this? What's happening with this? Where's my money? What's going on with this? Blah, blah, blah. You've got to set very strict parameters of, you're coming in as an equity investor, we'll talk once a month, but that's kind of as far as it goes. I can't be taking phone calls at midnight dealing with an investor because they're panicking or they want their money out early. So I think one of the risks is that you create more work for yourself, potentially by having a bad equity investor. But I think to a degree, the benefits outweigh the risks, in the sense of, at least you can then do more projects because you've got less money, or less of your own money in the deals, and it just allows you to grow quicker. Then the last question from ChatGPT on this little section is, how can private lenders or institutional investors be approached for funding? So this is talking about not how to approach a bank. This is talking about essentially approaching a private investor, or potentially a hedge fund, or a large investor. And I think a lot of it comes down, especially when it comes to the institutional investors, you need to have a track record. You need to have something that you can show. You need to be putting yourself out there on LinkedIn, even Instagram and Facebook to a degree, because you never know who's watching. But LinkedIn is where most of the institutional investors are going to be. Get a track record out there, show what you're doing, what you're delivering, have a niche product. There's a couple of guys on LinkedIn who do auction trading. They're constantly talking about auction trading, constantly talking about, this is what we're doing, this is what we've done, here's what we've achieved, here's the profit that we've got. And they're getting approached by people saying, well, we're an institutional investor, we've got hedge funds, we've got large investors behind us, we're willing to put some cash on the table for you. And I think that's their social media presence has led to that, and their track record has led to that. When it comes to approaching private investors, it's slightly lower down on the ladder. It's your Facebooks, your Instagrams, it's getting out to networking events, it's getting out to pension networking events as well. So any events where SaaS investors are all together and talking about what to do with their SaaS pensions, getting involved in groups where there's a lot of SaaS investors involved. I think that's where that one is slightly easier. I think you're not necessarily going to get approached by private investors the same as you would institutional funders. So I think getting yourself out there on Facebook, Instagram, networking events, all that kind of thing, doing a podcast, all gets you in front of sort of private investors. So I think that's probably the key ways to approach each of those. Then ChatGPT asked about exit strategies. So what are the typical exit strategies in property development? So, your first one, sales. So just literally building to sell. Then you've also got, obviously, build to rent schemes. So it may be student accommodation, it might be housing associations, it might be just standard open market rentals. You've then also got, obviously, dealing with sales bridges as well. So that is an exit strategy. Obviously, you are still selling, but that is a product to exit to that point. You may have these guaranteed purchases as well. So people who come in might be housing associations, might be supported living, might just be large institutional investors, come to you and they say, right, we will buy this entire development off you for 70, 80% of the market value. So that could be an exit strategy there as well. But as a rule of thumb, your main ones are either sales or refinancing. Next question is, how does the chosen exit strategy affect the type of finance a developer should seek? So when it comes to development finance, it doesn't really matter if you're selling or refinancing. It doesn't affect your development finance. But I think where it does have an impact is if you've got a housing association or a purchaser agreed up front, because what it actually does is it allows us to approach maybe development finance lenders who are ahead of where you should be. So if you're a first-time developer, you're not going to be dealing with challenger banks. You're going to be dealing with private lenders. If you're a first-time developer with a guaranteed purchase in place, you're going to be dealing with the challenger banks. So I think that's where the exit strategy does help, because if you can get those guaranteed exits in place, it just makes it so much more appealing to a development lender. And then the last question in this section is, what contingency plans should be in place if the initial exit strategy fails? So I think this is only really relevant with sales. So if you're trying to sell and the market drops or whatever, you need to be in a position where you can rent those properties. Now, we've got ones at the moment where we've got people who have built £800,000 5-bed houses. They're struggling to sell them, but they're also going to struggle to rent them, because an £800,000 house is probably only going to rent for £2,500 in Lincolnshire, which is where these are. It's not going to be suitable for a buy to let. So I think in that sense, if you're going into property development, you need to make sure that you're building something that can sell and that can rent, because you need to be able to hit both sides of that. And I think then also, if you're looking to refinance and the refinance fails, you also need to be aware of how you can obviously sell those properties as well. You need to be confident in the sales figures. If all else fails, it may also be that you need to be prepared to auction those properties as well. And I think the other thing that we've seen with a lot of people is they'll get housing associations lined up, and then the housing association will fail to go through with the purchase. Again, it needs to be that you're doing a development that works not only as a housing association purchase, but also as a standard open market as well. So don't go into development. I suppose this is the bit of advice. Don't go into a development that only has one exit strategy. So if it only works as a housing association development, I would say steer clear, because if you fail to get that housing association to complete, you are stuck with a development that realistically you then can't exit. Then the last section is market conditions. This should be a good one. So how do interest rate changes affect development finance? So we've spoken about this a few times on previous episodes. A lot of development finance lenders aren't affected by the Bank of England. So a lot of them are privately funded. They just set their own interest rates, and they're happy to just work at whatever interest rate works for them, with them being privately funded. However, there are a couple who are linked to the Bank of England base rate, and as such will then obviously move around their interest rates as that rate changes. The thing to be aware of, I think, when going into development finance is there tends to be a tendency to only believe that a buy-to-let or a commercial mortgage can have fixed rates or variable rates, but development finance and bridging finance can too. So I think one of the big things is, when you are going for development finance, when you're going for bridging finance, make sure you understand, is it a fixed rate? Is it a variable rate? Is it linked to the Bank of England base rate? If it moves, how quickly is it moving at your end? You need to understand these things before you go into development finance. So I think that's a really good question. And yeah, hopefully just a little golden nugget there, just to check on your development finance terms, on your bridging loan terms. Is it variable? Is it fixed? Then the next question is, what role does market research play in securing finance and ensuring project success? This comes down to each developer personally, I think, because market research is going to be key here, really. So we're talking about checking for comparables. We're talking about speaking to local agents. We're talking about speaking to valuers, understanding the market. If you're getting into rentals, speaking to housing associations, understanding what it is they offer, what it is they're looking for as well, because a lot of them will have a shopping list of what they want to look for. If you're going into service accommodation, understanding the market locally for service accommodation. Is it going to be contractors? Is it holiday makers? What is it that you're actually looking for as a tenant? So yeah, there's a lot in terms of market research that you need to do to make sure that it doesn't really affect the securing finance bit. I think the finance, whether you've done your research or not, I think the finance is going to happen if the project works. But I think what it does do is give you some confidence going into the project that the things work and that your exit plans work, and it allows you just to set up a bit of an A to Z of, well, if this doesn't work, I know this works. And if this doesn't work, I know this works. So I think that's where the market research comes into play, and things like Rightmove, Zoopla, speaking to local agents, it's always the best thing to do. And then the last question of this series is, how should developers adapt their financial plans in response to economic downturns, of which we have had a fair bloody few? I would say, in terms of adapting their financial plans, I don't like the term financial plans. Adapting just their plans in general, I think, with the amount of economic downturns that we've seen, and I think there's still possibly some more to come in the future, but I think their biggest thing that they can do is surround themselves with good people, make sure that they're on the right finance, because there's nothing worse than being on a bridging loan or a development loan and then something happening in the market and you're over leveraged. I think that's one of the big things, is making sure you're not over leveraged. And I think getting the right team around you to deliver the project as quickly as possible, because if you think something's going to take 12 months and it then ends up taking 18 months, and because it took 18 months, you then hit this period of downturn, I think it's so easily avoidable. I mean, none of us have got a crystal ball. None of us know what's going to happen in 12 months. None of us know what's going to happen in 2 years. But I think what is key is getting things delivered as quickly as possible. And that's where that team is so key. Getting on the right finance and just making sure that if anything does happen, you're not all of a sudden at 80, 90% loan to GDV because the market's dropped, and making sure that your build costs aren't all of a sudden jumping up by 10, 20%. It's all about locking everything down as early as possible and as best you can, and then delivering everything as quickly and as best you can. And I think the other thing as well is a lot of people have come out of COVID, have come out of everything else that's happened, and have jumped into doing developments of large executive homes. And I think there is still such a demand for small 2-3 bed houses. I think that is where, if you want to protect yourself from a downturn, that's where you want to move your plan to, because the risk you've got is doing large executive homes that realistically there's only a very small market for, as opposed to doing smaller 2-3 beds, which there is a much larger market for. I think you just run the risk of putting yourself in a box that's very, very difficult to get out of. So I think diversifying what you're building as well is a massive help. So hopefully you've enjoyed my little out of the blue interview with AI. It's quite interesting, some of the questions it's come up with. All I would ask, if any of you have got any questions, if you're listening on Spotify, there is a way of putting comments on and asking questions. If you're watching on YouTube, obviously pop any questions in the comments. And what we'll do is we'll try and make this a bit of a regular feature where we answer your questions and potentially some more questions from AI as well. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you found it useful. Catch you on the next one.